Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. And so, do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. You can certainly ring the bell, and we'd love to get a 5-star review of our channel. So, ringing the bell helps make sure that you know every time a new podcast goes out that you be sure to be aware of it. So, definitely do that. If you don't like dealing with YouTube, you can definitely download my podcasts over at Rumble. Just go to Wildlife Control Consultant. When you're at Rumble, at rumble.com, that's rumble.com, you can download my podcasts there. In fact, I usually post them up sooner. So that would be a way. We'd appreciate the support. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear your comments, thoughts about the shows, suggestions for future episodes. And if you have topic ideas and or people that I should interview, definitely reach out. Would love to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, as I say, I'm just going to talk about what I want to talk about. So what are we going to deal with this particular week? Well, I figured since we're getting into some bat season for some of you. Of course, it's maybe we're still in April, although May in some of your states you may be prohibited from doing some bat work. Nevertheless, you might be doing some bat work when you're removing young here in the near future from people's living spaces and that sort of thing. So let's talk about some safety issues and what's one of the most important safety issues that we have in wildlife control, and that is protection for our hands, and that's gloves. But what glove provides the best protection? Certainly you can get the thick elk skin gloves with the staples inside of them, but clearly that will probably for many of you be a little bit of an overkill because obviously it's extraordinarily thick and you lack some of the dexterity. So an interesting article was written, so let me pull it up here. Interesting article was written by Dr. Patricia Freeman and her husband, Cliff A. Lemen, Lemen, and they were at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I believe Dr. Freeman has retired since then. Lemen, I believe, was an adjunct. So they wrote an article and they did some research entitled Puncture Resistance of Gloves for the Handling of Bats. Now let me set a little context for you here. Now as a mammologist, Dr. Freeman and Dr. Lemen, they were both mammalogists, is that their concern, of course, was they needed to balance protection for their hands, but also the ability to physically manipulate bats because their audience are people that are looking to handle bats, perhaps perform measurements on them, to perhaps weights, such as weights and wingspan, foot measurements, and that sort of thing. So often for animal identification or perhaps putting a tag on the animal. So they need a high level of manual dexterity coupled with the ability to protect themselves from bites. So that is a little bit different, obviously, than most of us in the wildlife control field because we're not often handling animals in that sort of a sense of doing measurements and trying to do scientific research on them or record them and putting tags on them. However, some of you may want greater dexterity when you're doing certain things, perhaps part of your work. So what is the balance between dexterity and protection? So those, because the more protection you get, the less dexterity you get. By dexterity, the ability to manipulate things with your gloves, like picking up a penny off the table, sort of think, if that's kind of give you an analogy there. So the more dexterity you have, the less protection, because typically the glove is thinner at that particular point. And thickness clearly matters if you're trying to prevent yourself from getting a puncture by a bat. So what this article did, and this was published in 2009 in the Journal of Wildlife Management. So we're going to kind of summarize some of the things here. So let me just kind of give you that information again. So it's Dr. Patricia Freeman and Dr. Cliff A. Lemen, and the title of the article is Puncture Resistance of Gloves for Handling Bats, published in the Journal of Wildlife Management, very prestigious journal, volume 73, issue 7, pages 1251 through 1254. So we're going to be kind of giving you a little bit of a summary here. And so basically what they did was they calculated what the sharpness was of a bat tooth. And so they created a puncture tool that mirrored the sharpness of a bat's tooth. That way they could mechanically test the puncture resistance of various types of gloves. And they, they were getting into newtons here. And so they were clearly, this is a scientific paper. They were doing some heavy-duty work on this particular project. A lot of math here, but there's a picture of the type of implement that they ultimately created to show you the outline of the puncturing, to show you what a bat tooth would look like, and they created a mechanical device to take the place of a bat tooth, right? So this saves them from having to go through all the IACUC challenges. And so here are the various gloves types, the materials that they were testing. So they were split cow, pig, deer, goat, top grain cow, and elk. So those were the natural ingredients, natural leathers that they were testing against. They also tested cotton gloves and rubberized cotton gloves, if memory serves here. And so they tested all of these, and they had, they standardized the amount of force being put in, because they had another paper that they did where they actually calculated bite force of animals. And so they were using what's called a regression analysis. So you get a little bit of data, and then you basically estimate what it would be like along like on a line, on a scale. So for example, what would my bite force be if I weighed 50 more pounds? Or what would my bite force be if I was even smaller? Because typically bite force relates to animal mass. The more you weigh, or the bigger you are, the stronger your bite force. At least that's the way it is for animals. So they went through this particular process, and they evaluated the types of products to see what they are. So they tested cotton and plastic coated fabric gloves. You may have seen them. A lot of garden stores will have those. So they're they have a plastic coating on them, and they're made out of cotton. They're relatively inexpensive. They pointed out that those particular gloves provided little protection against bat bites. So if you're looking to protect yourself against bat bites, cotton and plastic coated fabric gloves are not the way forward for you. So you need to just set those aside and use those for other things. Here's this graph in the chart in the upper left hand corner here that tells you the types of bite forces that were being exerted and when they were basically penetrated. So obviously the higher the bars are on this scale, the more force was required to penetrate the leather. And you can see on this, and if you're wondering why the bars are so long, those show you the top, the highest level and the lowest level, and the box in the middle tells you what the average or the mean would be on that. So this would be, it showed you that top grain leather did pretty well, but split leather did the best in terms of protection against bat bite force. So if you're looking for the best protection of the leather gloves that are being offered here, split cow leather was the best. Split cowhide provided the best force. Now, one of the things they did mention in the article was that when you're evaluating leather gloves is you need to check to make sure that the leather is even thickness throughout the portions of the glove you care about. Because when you think about it, animal skin has different thicknesses depending on where you take it from. Typically, belly skin on an animal is thinner than the skin along the back or spine area. So when they're cutting the leather to make these gloves, they're obviously going to get it from different parts of, you don't know where they're going to get it from on the part of that particular cow, because the belly is going to be thinner than the spine. Same way with deer, for instance, right? So when you're checking the gloves, if you're saying, these are going to be my bat gloves, you need to take a few minutes at the store to feel the gloves to see where if there's excessive thinness or excessive thickness, depending if you want some dexterity, in the fingertip portions, the parts of the glove that are going to be more vulnerable for you to get a bite. You know, for example, most bats are not going to bite you on the back of the hand. I mean, is it possible? Sure, but typically when you are grabbing a bat, he's going to be biting along your fingers. So making sure that the leather is of the same thickness all the way around those sensitive areas is going to be important. So that's something that, you know, a manufacturer, as much as they try to standardize their equipment, there's going to be differences among gloves. So you need to take a few moments of time and just go to the store and check it out. Because when you have, you know, gloves manufactured from artificial materials, obviously the thicknesses tend to be a lot more even. But when you're dealing with natural materials like leather, those thicknesses can vary significantly enough for a bat to bite through or not bite through, depending on which way you go. So the order is, of course, split cowhide is the best in terms of overall protection. And so they continue on this particular level, on this particular issue, and they basically pointed out because top grain cowhide work gloves, one of the most common types available, this is a quote from them, were a poor choice because they offered less protection and no better dexterity than deerskin work gloves of similar thickness. So isn't that interesting? So top grain leather gloves that had the same thickness as deerskin offered less protection than deerskin gloves. And you actually lost dexterity that the deerskin gloves gave you. So that gives you a little bit of a clue where they're going here. And they actually say at the end of the article that deerskin gloves provided the best balance of dexterity and protection. Now, I want to be very clear about this so that you understand this importantly. Deerskin is not as protective as split cowhide. However, split cowhide, it lacks the dexterity that's offered by deerskin. And they have an interesting quote here at the end of their paper. Let me see if I can point this out. It says, deerskin work gloves are a good compromise of both puncture resistance and dexterity and are excellent for handling small to mid-sized bats approximately 4 to 40 grams. Thin goatskin gloves offer the maximum dexterity but can resist bites of only the smallest bats of 5 to 15 grams. Given the natural variation in leather and problems of wear, gloves are not absolute protection against bites of bats. That's an important thing. So you always need to make sure that when you're using gloves for an extended period of time, they're wearing thinner than they were when you bought them. So you need to be sure you're monitoring your equipment. Now, when I was back in the day, I mean, I was just using, welder's gloves for most of my work, right? I was a bit of a nervous Nelly, and so I was very, very protective of myself. But some of you are doing things that I never dreamed of doing out in the field. So you may want a more dexterity in some of the work that you're doing. And so understand from this particular research, they pointed out that deerskin had a lot of was more supple and had better dexterity than split leather gloves. And this increase in dexterity came with protection that offered about 82% of the protection provided by split leather gloves. Now that's amazing. So notice deerskin gloves are not as protective as split cowhide gloves. However, you're only losing about 18% of that protection. And if you're only dealing with small to medium-sized bats, then you're okay. Now, what's some examples of medium-sized bats? Well, let me kind of give you some indications here. I'm just going to find where that was, where that part of the article was. So just bear with me here as I'm looking for what she wrote, or what they wrote, I should say. So a mid-sized bat would be a big brown bat. They're at 15 grams. A hoary bat, for those of you dealing with that, that's up to 25 grams. So those would be examples of mid-sized bats. Now, large bats would be, for example, the greater spear-nosed bat. That's at 90 grams. And the great fruit-eating bat at 70 grams. So a little brown would be an example of a small bat. So typically speaking, I think for the vast majority of you, if I want to put myself on a limb here, for the structural dwelling bats, you're probably only going to be dealing with medium to small bats. But, definitely check if, when you're looking at large size bats or anything 40 grams or larger. And so let me just do a little bit of math here, or look at my little chart to find out how many grams. For those of you that deal in ounces, let's see how many grams we have in an ounce. Okay, so if we're dealing with 40 grams, what does that equal? That's about 1.5 ounces. So anything, it's actually 1.4 ounces. So anything 1.4 ounces or larger is going to be a large size bat. Anything smaller than that is going to be a medium to small bat. And again, small bats are 5 to 15 grams. So that's getting pretty tiny there. Let me just put in 15 grams. Kind of get an idea of what that is. That is going to be something as small as about 1/2 ounce. So that's 1.4 ounces large bat, up to about 0.5 ounces small bat, and then of course medium is going to be in between. So hope that's helpful for you, and let's kind of just go through again what your best gloves are. Here's the chart on the left. Notice what we have shows you the relative qualities. So in terms of the ability to puncture, split cowhide is the best, deer is the second best, top grain leather is third, and goat skin is last on that particular chart. But of course you can see elk is going to give you more protection than goat. So elk is above goat, but again, elk skin's going to be pretty expensive. So a lot of us are just probably going to go with the split cowhide for better protection. Of course, if you can just get a thick thick leather glove, like maybe a welder's glove or something. I don't know of any bat that's going to, at least the ones that we're dealing with, are going to go through that. It's just a matter of you getting a feel for it. Check out your deerskin gloves and understand that that gives you a balance of dexterity and protection. But if you want more protection, go something thicker, which is going to be the split cowhide, or go even thicker than that. So something for you to think about. Hope that's going to be helpful for you. You want to be safe out there. Definitely consult with your doctor about getting your rabies prophylaxis shots. These are the shots you would get before you undergo, before you get bit. Their prophylaxis protection against rabies. Talk to your physician about whether this is something wise for you. Sometimes your insurance will cover it, or workman's comp will cover it for those of you that have that. And it may be something just worthwhile because it could save you a world of expense if, God forbid, you ever do get bitten by a bat and aren't able to test that particular bat. So if you're going to be dealing with rabies vector species, it's just something you might want to consider getting. Again, there's always risk with any medication. However, with vaccines, of course, you're balancing the risk and reward. Just truth in advertising, I've had the rabies vaccine, and I believe I even had a booster. It's been a long time since I've had that. So, but nevertheless, this is an individual decision for you, but definitely something you want to talk with your physician, and you can certainly do some research. Maybe I'll even do a presentation on rabies vaccine just to kind of give you some background on that. But nevertheless, it may be worth the expense for those of you that choose to go that particular direction, because sometimes post-exposure shots aren't cheap. So it's that risk-reward thing that you've got to work out for yourself. So protect yourself, wear your PPE. You want to avoid getting bitten in the first place. For those of you that need to balance dexterity with protection, check out deerskin gloves. And let me give you the article name again for those of you that may have missed it. So this is going to be Patricia Freeman and Cliff Lemen, Lemen, not O-N, Lemen. The title of their article is Puncture Resistance of Gloves for Handling Bats, published in the Journal of Wildlife Management, 2009, volume 73, issue 7, pages 1251 through 1254. I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to our podcast, ring the bell so you can be made aware of future podcasts. And also, we'd love to get a 5-star review from you if you'd be so kind to do that. Those of you that don't want to deal with YouTube, you can definitely go over to Rumble and just look up Wildlife Control Consultant, and you can find my podcast listed there as well. We'd love to hear from you, your thoughts. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Appreciate some of the kind words that I've received from some of you. It's very encouraging to get some of those comments, and also your thoughts. I had an interesting letter that I may talk about in the future about the problems with carbon monoxide gas generators that people are using. I'm hoping to get them on the show. So if you're listening, hope to hear from you soon if we get that scheduled. So I'd love to have you on the show. Otherwise, again, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. And why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.